Welcome back to the London Futurists podcast. Our guest today is Holly Joint, who was born and educated in the UK but lives in Abu Dhabi in the UAE. She started her career with 5 years at business consultancy Accenture and then worked in telecoms and banking. The latter took her to the Gulf, where she then spent what must have been a fascinating year as Programme Director of Qatar's winning bid to host the 2022 World Cup. Since then, she's run a number of other startups and high-growth businesses in the Gulf. She's currently COO of Trivandi and also has a focus on helping women to have more power in a future dominated by technology. I met Holly at a conference in Dubai this year where she quizzed me on stage about machine consciousness. Holly, welcome to the London Futurist podcast.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm really delighted to be here.
It's good to meet you, Holly.
And you, David. Thank you for having me.
Holly, one of the interesting things you said when we met in Dubai was that you're quite content to live in a heavily surveilled state where multiple cameras record your movements and the movements of everyone you interact with. Personally, I agree with you. This state of affairs is acceptable, depending, of course, on the nature of the government. And over time, I suspect it may be inevitable. But I also suspect that a lot of our listeners will think it's a horrible idea. What would you say to them?
Look, I really appreciate concerns that people have over privacy, but ultimately it's a trade-off. And it's a trade-off that myself and people who live in the UAE as residents, as guests in the country, are very happy to take. I highly value the protections that the country brings for me and my family. It's part of a broader strategy that the UAE has around safety and security for residents and visitors. Also, I would say that any woman who moves around the big cities of the world has felt vulnerable at some point. Last time I was in London, I had my phone taken off me in the city of London, which is one of the most heavily monitored places in the world. There was nothing that the police could or would do in that situation, even though I could follow my phone around the city remotely. But it's inconceivable that would happen in somewhere like Abu Dhabi. I run at 5 a.m. I've never felt the need to look over my shoulder. We leave our cars unlocked. Of course, there is crime there, but the freedom that brings, the safety it brings for our families is something that makes us quite comfortable with the level of surveillance. I think also the comfort depends on the trust in systems and governance that you have in the government of a country. Collectively, we have very high trust in the UAE and very grateful to live there. Something else I would just add to those who are concerned over privacy. Surveillance extends far beyond cameras or intelligence operations. We live in a surveillance capitalism economy. Our data is a commodity that's being traded. Surveillance is all pervasive. If you have a credit card, a loyalty card, you use social media, mobile apps, location services, internet browsing, you're not just being watched, but your data is being used, you're being monitored in terms of what you're accessing. And there's not huge transparency about how that all works. I was listening to a company recently who was saying that from just 4 pieces of information around transactions that you make on a credit card, you can be identified personally from anonymized data sets. So from just 4 random pieces of information, they can identify who you are, which is phenomenal. So we're surveilled and monitored in every single part of our lives.
Holly, in some countries, people will be relatively relaxed about what their governments might do with the data that's picked up. What do you have to say to people living in other countries where there is much less of a trust of governance? Their political thoughts, their personal sexual orientation, their religious beliefs or lack of religious beliefs might be monitored and then held badly against them.
Yeah, absolutely. And it goes back to that point about having trust in the governance and the way those countries are run. And if you don't have that level of trust, then the surveillance starts to feel very uncomfortable. And I'd also say that We need to think very carefully how surveillance is being used, how biases are being perpetuated. If police can use data to predict a higher incidence of burglary in a certain area at a certain time, and then they increase patrols, and that is a deterrent, then that feels very acceptable. But then if certain communities start being targeted, then it starts to feel very uncomfortable and not quite right. So we just have to be really careful. So yes, it really depends on the level of trust that you have in the government in the country that you live.
As you know, Holly, I spent 3 years living and working in Dubai myself. And of course, the reason why the person-on-person crime rate is so low is many things in addition to the surveillance. One is the culture. There's not a culture of personal attacks. Another is the fact that most people living there are very wealthy by their own standards. The local people are obviously wealthy because of the oil revenues, and most of the other people living there, who are the majority, are migrant workers effectively. The Westerners and the subcontinental people are living there to make a living, sometimes to send money back and keep whole villages going in their home countries. And of course, the penal system is incredibly severe on anybody who does commit person-to-person crime. But I want to just respond a little bit to what you said about surveillance capitalism. That's a phrase that comes from Shoshana Zuboff's book of the same name. And it's always struck me as being a very overblown notion. In fact, that book is quite hysterical. Parts of it are just funny. The idea that Meta, which is right in the front line of these accusations, is surveilling us is just not true. They're collecting data on vast numbers of people and collating that data and selling information about large groups of people to advertisers. Nobody is interested in following me around. Why is Meta interested in me? They're interested in me as part of a large group of people who might buy, for instance, a can of Coke or a Mercedes car. It's really not surveillance. It's an inaccurate use of the term.
I agree with you that the data is aggregated, but then it's also used to inform what is pushed at you and to drive behaviors and to drive the content that it is put to you. I use Apple News, and sometimes I get hugely frustrated about the content that's curated and what I see. I'm in an echo chamber and I'm not seeing content about things going on in other parts of the world. And so while they're not monitoring you as an individual and your movements, they have huge power to influence. And that might be to get you to buy a suitcase, or it might be to influence political preferences on a wide scale. I wouldn't want to talk about Meta in particular, but that data gives this kind of power. And I think it's something that the public don't understand very well. And it's something we just need to be conscious of when we talk about surveillance and being monitored.
You indicated that the Abu Dhabi government is a pretty smart user of technology. But another interesting thing you said is that many, perhaps most of the companies operating there are behind the curve in the use of technology. How does that manifest itself in your everyday life? And have you got any ideas about why it's turned out that way?
I think Abu Dhabi's been named one of the top 10 smart cities in the world. It's a digitally enabled city. When I leave the airport now, I just have an eye scan. I don't have to present my passport at all. We have an authentication tool called UAE Pass. I can renew my car registration, my landlord tenancy. I can access my bank account and all other government services authenticated through that technology. It's hugely useful, and sometimes the UK seems very far behind because we don't have those kind of services. In the private sector, we see companies being more risk averse. I think there's a real challenge in the region around a skills gap. There's possibly a sense of operational inertia and a lack of a burning platform to drive those things. And when you look at the governments of the countries in the GCC, you see this huge ambition to be the best in the world and this incredible vision, but it's not translating into companies. They seem to be content not to be the best in the world. And of course, I'm hugely generalizing. I'd also say that globally, I think there's a challenge around short-termism in boards. and there is a lack of incentivizing boards for the long term. And so you're just not seeing the drivers that we need for investment in digital and AI that you would expect.
So who sets the incentives for the boards? Boards do what they're incentivized to do. Can't governments take a role in saying that boards should be rewarded only when they take longer term considerations into account?
I think it's very difficult for governments to be involved unless governments are shareholders in those companies. Of course, it's market forces that are driving those behaviours, but it's a real challenge, and it's driving culture, it's driving behaviours through those organisations as well.
I guess you travel around the Gulf since you're based out there. Obviously, Saudi Arabia and Qatar have made quite a bit of noise trying to catch up with the UAE and Dubai in particular, which has a reputation for being a forward-looking country, and I think genuinely is. How are they doing? Is the rest of the Gulf keeping pace?
Yeah, there's incredible enthusiasm and energy going on. I was in Riyadh recently, looking around for offices in Riyadh, and there was such a buzz and so much energy in all those places that I was looking at. People like to look at the headlines around the vision, strategies, targets of countries in the region and say they're unreasonable, that what they're trying to do is unachievable. But the reality is that these countries have the liquidity and capital to be bold. You don't build the tallest tower in the world or cities out of the desert without being forward-looking. We've got NEOM emerging in Saudi Arabia, a city emerging out of the desert based on AI and technology. Dubai and Abu Dhabi both vying to be smart cities. These aren't vanity projects. There's incredible vision. It's about driving GDP growth through diversification away from oil across all different sectors. As you mentioned in the introduction, I worked for the Qatar World Cup bid back in 2009. At the time, people didn't know what Qatar was. People thought of it just as an airline, didn't know it was a country. We were ridiculed for bidding, but it was incredibly forward-looking and bold to want to bid and then host that kind of event. And now we're seeing across the region that major events are a really powerful tool for driving country visions and strategy. At Trivandi, where I'm COO, we work with governments on major events and giga projects. We advise how to maximize opportunities and deliver a lasting impact from those opportunities. So it's really incredibly forward-looking in the region and all about diversification of the economy.
We can't really talk about Qatar and the 22 World Cup without talking about some of the controversy surrounding it. You're absolutely right. It was a really, really bold thing for them to do, and it definitely put them on the map. And it's not unreasonable to have wildly ambitious targets if you're in a region which has achieved wildly ambitious things. The creation of Dubai over the last 30, 40 years or so from more or less nothing is almost miraculous. But obviously, the Qatar bid was bedeviled by accusations of bribery and of poor treatment of migrant labourers and so on. The actual cup was incredibly successful, and the final was actually a very good match. I'm sure you didn't come across the nastier aspects of it, but did you have any sort of thoughts or any defense of it around that?
Yes, I think it's really tempting to look at everything through a Western lens instead of understanding the culture and traditions of the countries. There are multiple different topics, I think, that are very misunderstood and only seen through a Western lens. And also people don't realize that these kind of events do drive change. Every life lost, of course, is unacceptable. One of the things that we're doing at Trivandi at the moment is professionalizing the major events industry. We're putting together an academy that will create the first qualification around major events. And so in these countries, people can start thinking about all the different implications and topics that need to be considered in hosting these kind of events or giga projects.
What does Trivandi do exactly? I don't know much about it.
Trivandi is an advisory consultancy. We provide advisory around major events and also the building of venues for events and sports.
Is Trivandi just based in Dubai, or does it have a reach throughout the GCC, the Gulf region?
We have offices in London, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE.
Thanks.
Another subject that we discussed in Dubai was something that has been a problem for David and myself for some time, which is the shortage of women in futurism. We're always on the lookout for women to interview who are making significant contributions to technology and to futurism. AI research, in particular, seems to be very male-dominated, apart from the niche of AI ethics, which actually seems to be dominated by women. And some people think this is because the so-called tech bros in Silicon Valley are aggressive and arrogant and deliberately exclude women. I don't find that a very plausible explanation. Do you have an explanation for it?
Yes, I think we need to look beyond the simplistic explanations. I believe the reasons are multifaceted. We also need to separate out choice from opportunity. I believe in the US, about 25% of the tech workforce is female, so women are really underrepresented. The different reasons, I would say, are firstly society and cultural influences. There is significant gender stereotyping. I saw a report from PwC recently that in the UK, 16% of females have a career in tech suggested to them versus 33% for men. So right at the early stages, girls are not being seen as potential candidates for careers in technology. Second, there's a lack of role models, visible role models. In the same report from PwC, 78% of students can't name a female leader in technology. So the role models are just not visible. I think there are also educational barriers. The curriculum, the way that we engage young people in technology and careers in technology is not necessarily appealing to young girls. And so we need to think about that. Girls are just not being encouraged in the same way. Then I think the workplace does have a strong aspect to it. There's definitely something around the workplace culture. I started my career in the lad culture of the late 90s, where men, in one case, were crawling around the floor trying to look up my skirt. Another time when I was a consultant, I turned up on a client site in a room full of engineers, and the room went entirely silent, and 100 pairs of eyes followed me around the room. When you're being othered and objectified, you don't really feel that you can participate in that environment. It feels like very exclusionary. Now, I think things have changed a lot since then, and I'm not suggesting that those kind of behaviors exist in tech companies. But if there is some kind of bro culture or a very competitive environment that's less appealing for women, then it can feel very exclusionary. It's also important to remember that women are typically caregivers and that they have multiple different roles, and that you need a culture that will help and support women to both have that role as a caregiver and also be a full participant in the workplace. Then the final point I'd just like to make is around the gender pay gap, which is really significant. So if you and I have the same role, Calum, for every pound you earn, I will earn 28% less. And that gets more exaggerated the further that you go up organizations and also in higher paid careers. So there are multifaceted reasons, and it's a real challenge.
There's lots to dig into there. On the question of role models, who would you highlight as good role models for girls thinking about going into a career in technology or AI? People like Sheryl Sandberg or Melissa Mayer come to mind, but they're not so famous as most of the men role models that are often suggested.
In the UK, you have people like Martha Lane Fox, Dr. Sue Black, Dame Stephanie Shirley. Then there are some really incredible women who are brilliant on the technical side, but also have a really strong voice in AI ethics. Women like Temnit Jebru, I'm not sure if I ever pronounce her name correctly, and Joy Bualawumi, again, difficult name to pronounce. And I think we shouldn't underplay the role that women have an AI ethics or the importance of it, because big tech tools are used in our everyday lives, and these companies define the information that people consume. And what we're seeing is that women in tech companies are being bold and standing up. 8 out of 10 of the top whistleblowers, when I was doing some recent research in tech companies, were all women. They weren't necessarily in ethics roles, but what the research suggests is that when you're a minority, you're perhaps more willing not to toe the line and to speak out when you see things that are going wrong.
On the question of participation in panels, I had an instance recently when I saw a meeting advertised talking about exciting visions of the future. And I looked, and the 5 panelists were all men. And I thought, oh my goodness, I'm not sure I can even put this on my social media. Normally I would highlight such an event and encourage my followers from London Futurists to pay attention. I thought, if I do this, it's not going to be good. And then I saw a woman complained to the organisers, what have you done with 5 men on the panel? And the answer was, we asked 3 women to be there and none of them could make it. I think this might play to your observation that women often have other dimensions to their lives. They are often family caregivers more than men are as well. Should that organiser have tried harder?
Yes, I think so. I think it is a requirement for all of us to try harder to get more representation. And if we think more broadly about women's economic participation, it's hugely valuable and important to the economy. And if you think about tech companies in particular, if you do that extra work, you work a bit harder to get women in, then you're increasing the talent pool. That's going to drive innovation. You're going to have different viewpoints in your organization. And so you'll inspire more creativity. There's evidence that having women on teams drives more effective teamwork. And also, really importantly, you'll understand your customer base better, which will help the market reach. So there's a real commercial incentive to have women participating in the economy and in tech firms and on panels.
I think those are all very strong points. There's 8 billion humans on this planet, and a little over half of them are women. Not to make maximum use of all that talent is just insane, as well as being completely unfair. And as you say, diverse groups get better results. So there's tons of good reasons to do it. Of course, the question is how to do it. And it's a tricky question because the causes are so diverse. There's also the interesting question of the position of women in the Gulf, in the UAE and in Saudi. I know from personal experience that those countries are changing very fast. And in the West, they often don't get the credit that they deserve for it. There was a lot, frankly, of out-and-out racism about the criticism of Qatar. What's it like, though, to be a professional woman living and working there? And are you noticing any change over the time that you've been there?
Well, first of all, thank you for asking the question and for highlighting that I think people look through a very Western lens at some points. I've been in leadership positions in the region for the last 20 years. I think one of the interesting things is when I left London nearly 20 years ago, I always felt like I had to morph into a man and not really bring my authentic self to work. I haven't felt that in the GCC. I have felt that I can be authentically female, be the person that I want to be when I come to work. If you look at both the UAE and Saudi, they've been making really targeted efforts to enhance women's participation across the whole economy, but particularly in the tech sector. It's a key part of the economic growth and modernization. In the UAE, we see huge investment in education and training in STEM fields. There are women in tech groups like my own group, Women for Tech, which are trying to support women with knowledge, mentoring, role models, and give them more knowledge and power in the area of technology. There's government support for tech startups and female-driven startups. And in Saudi Arabia, we're seeing the same thing with educational reforms, public campaigns, scholarship programs, tech incubators. There is so much energy and what we see is that women are outperforming men at school and university. They are really passionate and committed to driving their careers. It's just incredible to see these brilliant, smart women emerging. There are still challenges. There are, of course, societal challenges. But I think it's really important that people, rather than observing from afar, come to the region and speak to the women who are here and really understand their viewpoint, understand the role that they play in society.
One of the things I notice when I go to events in the Gulf is that in the audience, women outnumber the men generally, which is not the case in a lot of conferences and events in the UK and America. And they're not there as padding. They're not being sent there by their school or university to make up the numbers, because they ask really smart questions and they're obviously very engaged. So, yeah, it does look to me like in some number of years, the Gulf countries may even leapfrog over Western countries in terms of the involvement of women.
Yes.
Which would be quite an ironic thing to happen.
I don't have the data to support that. That's something I'm doing some research into at the moment to try and back that up. But I think the rate of change is so fast in the GCC in terms of female participation that I do think the efforts that the UAE is putting in to have female representation on boards means that the UAE will overtake the US and the UK in terms of female participation at senior levels.
So continuing the theme of looking to the future, you mentioned that Dubai is already counted as one of the top 10 smart cities in the world. Many of the countries in the GCC have the aspiration to be in the top 10 in terms of AI innovation, AI development, as well as just users of AI. Do you think that's credible? That in 5 or 10 years' time, there may be as much innovation coming out of these countries as, say, in Europe or America?
I think so. There's an incredible vibe around it and massive investment. In Abu Dhabi, we have an AI council with very senior people on it. There is a huge focus on AI. You can see that in terms of the people from Silicon Valley who are coming to the region looking for investment and the outward investment going into these tech companies. You can also see it through projects like Falcon, the Arabic language LLM. It's really exciting. There is so much buzz, so much energy, and it's really attracting talent, which is the most important thing.
And what could go wrong if in 10 years' time this hasn't happened? What would you have wished had gone differently?
Great question. I think that we need to sometimes go slow to go fast. While you don't want innovation to be slowed down by regulation, I think there is the need to pause and to consider what the implications can be. I don't believe that in the very near future, we're going to have the situation where we reach the singularity and that robots have taken over the world. But we really need to consider what we're doing. We need to think about the biases in the models. We need to think about transparency. We need to make sure that we're putting the safeguards in place. And going back to the point around women and other underrepresented minorities, we need to make sure that this technology is truly for everyone and that it's not just being driven out of a small hub in the west coast of America. And I'm really delighted that the Arab world is playing such a leading role in this.
Yeah, I think that's right. David and I actually do take singularitarian ideas quite seriously. Of course, we don't know when artificial general intelligence and superintelligence might arrive, but we both think that it is coming. And also, probably before that, or maybe at the same time, there's going to come a time, we think, when there won't be jobs for humans because machines will be able to do pretty much everything that humans can do for money, and they'll do it cheaper, better, and faster than us, and therefore there just won't be jobs for humans. And if we're smart and perhaps a bit lucky, that could be a very good thing for humans because most humans don't really get much meaning out of their jobs. They do their jobs primarily to put food on the table. They get meaning out of other things like family and friends and religion possibly and beliefs and hobbies and so on. I've sometimes had the slightly odd thought that the Gulf countries are better positioned than anywhere else in the world to deal with the economic singularity. Because when the time comes, if it does, when machines can do everything that humans can do for money, the Gulf countries are in the luxurious position that they can send a lot of their workforce home. And a much smaller number of people are left to have to provide resources for through something like not universal basic income. That's a terrible idea because of the little word in the middle, basic, but universal comfortable or universal generous income. So the Gulf countries, in a sense, have less reason to fear what I like to call the economic singularity than many other countries. So they can kind of rush towards it slightly more boldly, perhaps, than other countries. I'm not sure if they've ever thought about it like that, and that may be a pretty far out idea. Does that sort of idea have occurred to you?
I think it's really interesting. The first thing that I would say is that technology can do a huge amount, but we don't always want to adopt technology to do those things, or we don't necessarily have an interest in it. So I first saw a demo of a smart fridge back in the late 90s, but it's still not a mainstream technology because we actually have just not found it useful. We have privacy concerns about our fridge spying on us. And so it's never been truly adopted. So I think we need to ask questions. Just because we have the potential with AI, do we want AI to do everything? While a lot of jobs are not necessarily enjoyable or giving people purpose and are just to put money on the table, we do get huge pleasure from creativity. And I think that's part of the essence of us as humans. I think humans will still want to create. And I don't know that there will be a case where we surrender all our creativity to machines, because we'll still want to make music, we'll still want to write, we'll still want to draw, because we get such enormous pleasure from it. In terms of the Gulf, yes, they could be in a position to send everyone home. But actually, the whole diversification of the economy has been encouraging people to move to these regions. You could see a future, if the economic singularity comes to pass, where they won't rely on people settling in those regions to drive the economy further. They won't need the consumers of all the things that are being created. But I'd be surprised if that happens. You still want people to buy property, which is a big driver of the Dubai economy. You want people to consume products. You want people to go to these major events. And so I'd be very surprised if these countries were taking a step backwards.
Just on your point about people still doing work after the economic singularity, if and when it arrives, I completely agree. I know lots of people who write and paint, and some of them make statues. They're not going to get paid for it, but they do it because it's fun, it's creative. We're hardwired to work. We'll always work. The question is whether we'll get paid for it if there's a machine that can do the job cheaper, better, and faster.
I see the economic singularity as being further off perhaps than other people. I think a lot of the tech guys who are talking about the potential of what LLMs can do don't actually know the reality of what it's like in an organization in different parts of the world where data's not well organized, processes aren't documented. These organizations are just not AI ready. So I think it's going to take much longer than people imagine for us to be using AI to pick up all these different tasks within organizations and then to just remove all the jobs.
But mightn't it be the case that those organizations who have got badly structured data and so on, they will be overtaken by a new set of nimbler, better organized companies, new organizations maybe that are decentralized, those who do flow with AI? That's always been the case, isn't it? When there's disruption, many of the old companies go out of business.
Yes, absolutely. And I'm sure we'll see that. We're always seeing that with different innovations that come along. But we do have to be careful. You get companies that are truly innovative, but then also forget governance or have lax governance. Some of these really big tech successes we've also seen fall apart and not be so successful because they've lacked basic structures and governance. We saw that with Silicon Valley Bank last year when there was a run on the banks. So I don't think it's as straightforward as people think it will be.
Sometimes you need to go slow to go fast, to quote you. I thought that was a very good phrase.
Very nice.
Thank you. Absolutely. It's something that I apply to lots of different parts of life.
That's a very nice note on which to wrap up. Holly, thank you very much indeed for joining the London Futurist podcast.
Thank you so much. Really enjoyed the discussion.
Thank you.